All right. Well, thank you for joining us. My name is Mike Archer. I'm with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. I work in our water resources um, planning and programming division, and I was asked to talk about our commission and how we are protecting our water for future use. Um, the Nebraska Game and Parks mission, our mission is the stewardship of state fish, wildlife, park, and outdoor recreation resources. That managing those in the best term long interest of people and those resources. We were created original in 1879, which was followed by the creation of the Nebraska Game and Fish Commission in 1901. So, just a little bit about me and my background as we get into this. Um, I have a Bachelor of Science degree from UNK. I studied biology with a wildlife emphasis there. And out of college, I jumped right into working for Nebraska Game and Parks. I worked as a conservation technician. Started out at Lake McConaughey and Lake Ogallala, counting fish and doing fish creels and water quality monitoring, and basically just a little bit of everything. And that moved me over when that job was done to doing pallet sturgeon recovery project work on the Missouri River. After that, I was given an opportunity to return to school and get a master's degree, and I did that at UNL, continuing to work on the Missouri River actually, and working with fish community populations within that lower Missouri River. After that, I became a biologist with the pallet sturgeon recovery project, um, doing pallet sturgeon telemetry and looking at habitat use and reproductive behavior of the endangered pallet sturgeon. And after that, I landed at Nebraska Department of Energy, Environment and Energy for a number of years, working as a state lakes coordinator there. I worked a lot with a lot of water quality, working with our beach watch, beach monitoring program, our ambient lake monitoring program, Clean Water Act restoration projects, and a lot of water quality and lake research projects as well. And all of that was built up to land me here. I'm currently working in the planning and programming division as an assistant division administrator. Like I said, I oversee the water resources that we have within our agency and what that means really. Over the last few years, I'm sure you all have heard that there's, this emphasis in Nebraska on water quality, whether it be groundwater quality. Certainly, that's the big emphasis right now, right? Is drinking water quality, but it's all tied together. And our agency has really recognized how important water resources are. So we were able to add some staff over the last couple of years, and we have added, we've a watershed ecology program manager, and he's housed with, it's really great for us that he's housed with the Department of Environment and Energy folks at Holdridge. So he gets to work really closely with those guys that are doing a lot of environmental work and a lot of environmental monitoring. And, he's also working a lot with some of our partners that are out there in that area. We've been really lucky that we've been able to expand our water team to address a lot of the challenges that we have within our state when it comes to water and our agency's mission with that. So, what do we do? We do a lot of collaboration with within our agency, right? Obviously, we work with fisheries a ton, work with wildlife a lot, parks, even engineering and outdoor education, because they all are so important to get that message out about our water resources and how important they are for us. But we also collaborate outside of our agency a lot. I work a lot with other state agencies, DNR, Department of Natural Resources, of course. They're the agency that's in charge of our surface water, right? They're the ones that hold a lot of the regulatory tools when it comes to surface water quantity. Okay, and then we work with Department of Environment and Energy, and they're the ones that hold a lot of the regulatory tools when it comes to surface water and groundwater quality. But we also work with DOT, Department of Transportation, and a lot with the natural resource districts across the state. But we also work with federal agencies, like Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Recreation, the whole acronym alphabet, right? Take your pick. all the USACE, the Army Corps of Engineers, and USGS service, and a lot of conservation organizations. And we'll break into the how we work with this here as the presentation goes along. But there's a lot of folks who work with Crane Trust, Audubon, Rainwater Joint Basin, Nature Conservancy, lots of different folks, and a lot of municipalities, particularly irrigation districts, power companies, but cities and other folks as well. So what are we talking about when we talk about water? We're talking about really two things. We're talking about water quality. Uh, Poor water quality leads to the kinds of pictures that you see here. These toxic algae, harmful algal blooms that you hear so much about later in the summer, right? The green water, blue-green water. But we're also talking about quantity. Here's a picture of Lake McConaughey. Two very stark differences, right? 2005 was one of the worst years Lake McConaughey has ever seen. We were in the middle of a very long drought. As you can see, that reservoir is not very full. As a matter of fact, that was probably about 30% full at that time, compared to 2018, which is, we had more water in the system, and that reservoir is looking at about, 75% full there in that picture. And there's a stark difference. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of acre feet here that can make a difference. And so the quantity aspect of things is huge for us, right? Especially a recreation resource like Lake McConaughey. If there's no water, how do we keep fish surviving? If there's no water, how do we keep recreators coming? And of course, Lake McConaughey is huge, and we can do that there. But on a smaller scale, we have other lakes and other reservoirs that are really struggling at times. So I want you to take note of this picture and keep it in your brain, this watershed picture. What is a watershed? And I'm going to keep coming back to this throughout the whole presentation. That's really sort of how we approach our efforts to protect the water in Nebraska. So a watershed is an area or a ridge of land that separates water from different river basins and seas. And this can be defined on scale, right? You have this really cool picture here, right? Rain comes down, falls on the land, runs across the land, falls into a little stream. Maybe it falls into this wetland, right? Maybe it soaks into the ground and becomes groundwater. It all flows down, or it all goes to somewhere. And that somewhere is kind of how we define that watershed area, right? All of that water flowing to a common point. And as you can see, right, there's all kinds of things on the watershed that could affect that water quality, right? Maybe this wetland is helping to remove nutrients out of that water that's coming across and being a real benefit. Maybe these houses are putting a lot of fertilizer down on there. It's running in the water and adding nutrients to the watershed. Or maybe one of these businesses is, has something going on that's adding negatively. But it all matters. It all matters in that watershed, and it all really comes down to scale. And what I mean by that is, you look at this, and this is the Missouri River watershed. 500, almost 530 square miles. It drains 1/6 of the United States. That's massive, right? One of the largest watersheds we have in the country. And even if you scale it down and say, the Platte River, for example, well, the Platte River is part of that watershed. But even then, it's still massive in comparison to other watersheds, right? Platte River is 85,000 square miles of land that drains. So doing projects and protecting water at scale is a challenge. That's huge. And we'll get into that Platte River watershed here in a second, but and the Missouri River too. But that scale matters. And here's a picture that's a little hard to take without context, but this is Conestoga Reservoir outside of Lincoln, Nebraska. Lincoln's up here, and Conestoga Reservoir is here. So how do we define that watershed? Well, there's some scientific ways to do it, or you can do it like I did for this presentation and just draw it, right? Because you can see all of these little tributaries that are all draining to a common point, right? And they're all flowing down Holmes Creek here. They're all finding their way down to Conestoga Reservoir. You got this creek and its tribs flow into Conestoga Reservoir, right? They're all flowing to a common point. And that is what the Conestoga Reservoir watershed looks like. How does that look at a bigger scale? Well, here's the Lower Platte River up here, and here's our little tiny Conestoga Reservoir watershed, which is really large, but in comparison and at scale, it makes a difference, right? So as we do projects, we have to keep that in mind. Where are we working? What are we working with, and at what scale? So let's jump into really what we're talking about as far as what do we do as an agency, and what do I do in my job and our water resources team. We don't. I mentioned that Nebraska Department of Natural Resources is in charge of the water quantity issue, right? The surface water quantity issue, and Department of Environment and Energy is in charge of the water quality issue. Well, the Department of Natural Resource, or the Natural Resources districts across our state, they're in charge of the groundwater, right? It's sort of how it's all divided up. Well, where does that leave Nebraska Game and Parks Commission? We were given a few legal options, right? And one of them is called an in-stream flow protection. Right? And really what you're defining that as is the amount of water that's needed in a stream or river to sustain its natural functions and the uses that depend on it. So what we're saying is what fish, what wildlife, and how and recreation that we define. What amount of water do we need to protect those things? And also included in that is groundwater recharge. And that's something that we can talk about as far as the NRDs use that a lot too. But those are, that's one of the major tools that we have in our toolbox when we're talking about protection of water in Nebraska as far as game and parks goes. This ability to apply for an in-stream flow permit, in-stream flow protection, statutorily is given to Nebraska Game and Parks Commission and the state's natural resource districts. We are the ones that can apply for those. And really it's just because of the way it's laid out with the fish, wildlife, recreation, and groundwater recharge. So those are the things that we are bound to protect and we will work to protect. So what does that mean in Nebraska itself, right? So we have a handful of in-stream flows. We don't have a ton, but as far as game and parks goes, we have the Lower Platte River, which is this section here. Okay, we have the Niobrara River. We actually have two on the Niobrara River. We have one that was acquired through Spencer Dam, and another one that we had applied for as far as fish and recreation goes. The Central Platte River, which we use as protection for whooping cranes, least terns, and piping plovers. And Long Pine Creek up here, which was our very first in-stream flow protection. And the NRDs have also got some. Central Platte NRD has one also on the Central Platte River. Lower Loop NRD has recently gained one on the Loop River here. And Lower Elkhorn NRD has gained one for the Elkhorn River. And these are all used to protect, like I said, those fish, wildlife, and recreation that's going on there. And there's some caveats to that, right? Most of these have time frames on them. If we have our Central Platte in-stream flow, there are certain times where we have that protection. And what does that really mean? Well, it means that basically we've done studies, we've done the research, we've calculated what amount of water needs to be left in the river to benefit the species that are within that river. And in the case of the Central Platte River, we're talking about whooping cranes and plovers, right? So we have an in-stream flow protection that says we get that we need this much water left in the river for those species. And in the Central Platte, we have that in the spring, right? And say up at Niobrara, we have it mostly year round for species up there. Each in-stream flow is different, timing, amount, so on and so forth. It's all different because each river system is different. Each species need is different. So We've done the work. We've calculated out what is needed and applied for that permit through Nebraska Department of Natural Resources. And the other big tool we have in our toolbox is our environmental review. This is commonly referred to as NESCA. It's the Non-Game Endangered Species Conservation Act. And really what this is a statute that says that any state agency that's doing work across the state has to ensure that whatever work they're doing does not further jeopardize any endangered or threatened species. So, for example, if Nebraska Department of Transportation is building a road through the Salt Valley, and they're endangering the Salt Valley or the Salt Creek tiger beetle, they have to prove that the work that they're doing is not going to further jeopardize that species, right? That's an endangered species. So they have to file a permit, they have to map it out, they have to ensure that the work they're doing, and then we get to review that, make sure that the work they're doing does not further jeopardize or endanger. And that's not only applicable to aquatic species, right? That's wildlife, bugs, plants, anything that would be endangered or threatened. Obviously, these two aren't fish. You got your Salt Creek tiger beetle and whooping crane, but very much dependent upon a healthy watershed and water quantity to survive. And so that's where we come in. We work with that environmental review team a lot on protecting those aquatic species and those watershed species that are depending on that water. So, what I'll break down here next is sort of our agency, the work that our agency does, and how that relates to water, right? And a lot of it, is the things you see, right? Of course, everyone goes out fishing. We all see the fish, but what does that mean? So our fisheries division is broken up into fisheries management. We have population assessments. We have stocking plans. We have angler outreach. We have angler access. Population assessments are important because we need to know how healthy that lake or reservoir is. We don't just assume that it's doing well. We can go in, we can catch fish, we can trap fish, we can sample for fish, and get an estimate of how many, what kinds of fish are there, and make that assessment of, is this water body really healthy? Which in turn tells us, is this watershed really healthy? If the lake isn't healthy, it's very likely that the watershed is not either. Maybe even the watershed is. So having those population assessments is critical. Having stocking plans in place, right? Where do we need to put more fish, and what's the best use? What kinds of fish? All to keep those populations healthy, keep those lakes healthy. Excuse me. And I put angler access on there. And you say angler access and you think of fishing piers and handicap ramps. And that's all, yes, angler access, and it's all important. But for us, sometimes that means actually just having access to water. If you go out in western Nebraska where it is considerably drier, angler access can mean that the lake is drawn down so much due to demands on that water that fishermen simply can't even get to the lake. Can't put your boat in because the boat ramp is high and dry. Ensuring that, we're working to ensure that there's enough water in those reservoirs for our citizens to use and enjoy those reservoirs is important. And angler access is one of them. So, that quantity issue is big. On the other side of that coin is the quality issue, right? And fish kills. We work very closely with Department of Environment and Energy when fish kills are reported. We'll go out, we'll do an assessment, we'll do an investigation and track those fish kills. And oftentimes you say fish kill and people think, oh, somebody, dumped a bunch of toxic waste in the water. Well, maybe that's pretty rare, right? Oftentimes a fish kill is related to watershed and the quality of watershed that reservoir lake is in. And I say that, fish kills are oftentimes related to what's called a dissolved oxygen sag. And we'll trace that back and say, when you too many nutrients in the water can lead to too much growth in the water and can lead to a fish kill. So what does that mean? Well, when you're at home and you put fertilizer on your lawn turns nice and green. Looks beautiful. You put fertilizer in your water turns nice and green. Not so beautiful, right? And you get all of this green growth growing in your lake, and it's, photosynthesis works, produces oxygen during the day. The sun's out, the plants are thriving, producing oxygen. Well, at night, the opposite side of that is when there's no sunshine, all those plants and all that green growth is no longer producing oxygen, but it's actually using oxygen. And we have too much photosynthesis going on throughout the night. There's too much oxygen being used, and it doesn't leave enough for the fish, and you can end up with fish kills. Very, very common issue late in the summer in a watershed that's got poor water quality, or poor habitat that's leading to poor water quality. So we work with our sister agency NDE and track those fish kills, investigate those fish kills to try to get an assessment of what's going on there with those. We also have our fisheries research team. There's divided up into a few sections there, but our rivers and streams team, right? They do research on fish presence and abundance, mussel presence and abundance, the freshwater clams and snails and all of that stuff. Those are all indicators of good watershed health or bad watershed health too, depending on what's present. But habitat within a stream is a great indicator of watershed health. You see these guys out here in this beautiful stream out west, and there's lots of good fish habitat. Obviously, the water's nice and clear. You would suspect there's a really good, healthy watershed right there. And that's that's the work they do. You can go and ask them. We could walk over there and say, hey, what are our 5 best streams? And they'll know right away. They'll know what watersheds are healthy. On the contrary, you can say, hey, what are our 5 worst watersheds? They'll know right away, right? They do that work. They've been out there wading through it all. So the other part of that research, fisheries research team, is the Missouri River Pout Sturgeon Project. And that's another great example of watershed health. That Missouri River is huge, but below Sioux City, the habitat was reduced and in size to make a shipping channel, much to the detriment of pout sturgeon and numerous other native species that were historically found in the Missouri River. So, that team is working to figure out ways to restore that population and restore the integrity of that watershed. And we also have our irrigation reservoir specialists, and those guys work. Reservoirs are sort of the bottom of the watershed, if you will. So those guys work really hard at assessing the health of our irrigation reservoirs. McConaughey, Harlan, all of those big reservoirs out west are all irrigation reservoirs. They work with those to make sure that the watershed that those reservoirs lie in is healthy and good. Then, of course, we have our fish production team. Those are the ones that are out there stocking fish. See the trucks, of course, dumping trout or bass or whatever. But they also do a lot of other important work, right? They're reproducing mussel species that have gone. Populations have really taken a fall with the decline in water quality and the decline in watershed health and stream health. So they're out there, working on producing mussels and restocking those mussels, so we can really increase the integrity and the value that those streams have. And they also do disease monitoring. You have fish living in an environment that is less than ideal, and they become stressed. Their bodies aren't working as well as they could, and they become more susceptible to disease. So disease monitoring is a really good way for us to get an assessment of what's going on out there in our waters, what's going on in that stream or that lake. Why are all these fish suddenly having this issue? And they're experts at that and really help us out to make those assessments. And of course, we have our private waters program, which does all of this, all of that above work, except on our private waters. They work with private landowners, HOAs, cabin owners, and so on and so forth on these private waters. to do all of that work that I just stated with them, and the obligatory picture of my own son out here catching walleye while I'm at work. But, those private water programs are huge because Nebraska's 98% privately owned. So that private waters program is a great outreach tool for us to reach those private waters that lie within those public watersheds. And of course, we have our aquatic habitat program, and this program does so much for the integrity of our water program, right? The aquatic habitat program basically is funded through a stamp that you are buy with your fishing license, and that money all goes back into aquatic habitat. The biggest project we've done, the most visible project we've ever done, is this Conestoga reservoir renovation. It's, it's our biggest one we've ever done. It's close to Lincoln, so lots of people get to see it. And this, what I like to point out about this is everybody sees the lake, right? Everybody sees the fishing piers. They see that we remove sediment. They see that we, improve the fishery itself. But what they didn't see was all the work that went into the watershed before that. There was almost 10 years of work prior, working with landowners up above, working with other agencies and NRDs to improve that watershed and put best management practices in place within that watershed. So all of the work that we did in the reservoir was for naught, right? So we can protect that work that was done in the reservoir by making sure that the watershed up above it is healthy. And there was just great work done, that things like grass buffer strips along the stream, tons of wetland creation, renovating ponds that were helping the integrity of that watershed. So much work was done before we ever even turned a shovel over in the reservoir itself. Huge project, and it's been a really good success for us. Some other projects on a much smaller scale that we've done, it's like Lake Helen and Gotham. Removed a bunch of sediment. Sediment in Nebraska is our number one pollutant, actually. It finds its ways. We have lots of reservoirs in Nebraska, and sediment always finds its way to those reservoirs. So lots of sediment removal, habitat improvement, water quality improvement. That lake is super clear, really clean. It's beautiful. And of course, angler access. And Harlan County Reservoir is a big one that we're just finishing up now. Of course, we didn't renovate the whole lake, but we have renovated a cove of there, and that required sediment removal and detention of future sediment, as well as habitat improvements and water quality improvements. And then, of course, the Conestoga Reservoir, which was sediment removal, detention, angler access. And one of the things I always like to point out, this is the far west end of Conestoga here. And this used to all be just open lake here on the west end, and we built this detention structure here, which slows and stops sediment from entering the lake. But we also built all this complex of wetlands, right? Wetlands are nature's little filters, little water filters, and we have this huge complex of wetlands, which provides great habitat for, of course, fish, but invertebrates and birds and waterfowl and all of these other species that utilize that huge wetland complex that was created there as part of the Conestoga renovation. And we also do some stream work. We have our Cool Water Streams program, which has done a lot of renovation work in these streams that are more they're better habitat for our cool water species, like the trout, for example, and others that you so often see out, in the mountains and out west where they have more cold water streams. But we've done, Long Pine Creek and Bordeaux Creek, Dry Spotted Tail Creek, that over the years the watershed has just degraded enough that it needed some rehab, and there was lots of habitat work done in there. And of course, that watershed BMPs, right? All really valuable to restore those. And of course, we have our aquatic invasive species. It's our exotic and non-native aquatic organisms. They really pose a threat to not only our recreation, but our water supply and our water infrastructure within the state, especially when you're talking like zebra mussels. They can be found on all of our water intakes and things like that. So tracking those is huge. And Much like our aquatic habitat, this is a user-funded program. There's an additional fee when you register your boat, and that money, that extra fee, goes straight to our aquatic habitat program, and that pays for things like outreach and education, boat inspections, sampling efforts, all of this to track invasive species. That group collaborates with the Nebraska Invasive Species Council a lot, working on public outreach and information and current and future threats. And we also work with UNL as they're developing an invasive carp threat assessment for us. Invasive carp, if you're not familiar, there's a couple of different species that we have concern with, and that's the silver carp and the big-headed carp. And the silver carp are sort of notorious all over YouTube as their response to a boat motor in the water is to jump and hit the boat driver in the head. They tend to jump out of the water and land in boats and jump all over as a natural response to get away from a perceived threat. So getting invasive carp into any of our reservoirs and into our boating recreation areas would be a huge problem for us. And we want to know where the threats lie. And UNL is working pretty diligently on assessing that threat of where do we need to focus our efforts to prevent introductions of these invasive carp. And we also have done some environmental DNA sampling. Really, this is pretty cool science. It's not perfected yet, but it's kind of cool in that we can just go take a water sample and scan it for DNA fragments, get us an indication if there's any invasive species in that water. So, like I said, it's pretty new science. It's cool science, but it's new. But why do we care, right? Why do we care about aquatic invasive species? What does this do for our water? Well, you have, I borrowed this picture off the internet, so thank you, whoever made it. But, in a normal ecosystem, you have this, the bottom of the food chain area, this phytoplankton, these microscopic little green and invertebrate creatures growing, right? And they're the bottom of the food chain. They are the food for these other bigger grazing invertebrates that are eating this as food. And these grazing invertebrates are food for small fishes, young of year sport fish, right? And the baby fish, right? And those baby fish are, of course, food for larger fish. Those larger fish, of course, become food for the fishermen. And you have this cycle, right? And when it's in balance, it works perfectly. But what happens if you put an invasive species in there? It disrupts that chain. For example, an invasive carp species that eats this, right? It'll take out this whole section of the food chain. And all of a sudden you don't have food for those young of year fish, those new fish that were just hatched don't have a food source. So all of a sudden now your big fish don't have anything to eat and their populations dive. And it's this vicious cycle. And then your fisherman has nothing to catch because this invasive species has wiped it out. So it's huge. It's a big deal for us. It's a big deal for our environment, and one that we put a lot of effort and time into preventing. So let's jump into the wildlife real quick here. When you think of water and wildlife, think of things like this invasive bullfrog here, but also snapping turtles and other turtles and amphibians, all those things that live along the water. But we also have whooping cranes, of course, and we have one of the things that we spend a lot of time with as a water team. Spend a lot of time with this Platte River Recovery and Implementation Program. This is an agreement from 1997 between Colorado and Nebraska and Wyoming to collectively manage the Platte River for the health of the ecosystem that people do. Like I said, it's a collaboration between those three states. Nebraska DNR is the state representative, but we also work with DNR very, very closely on this, as they, of course, are experts in water quantity. We bring the wildlife expertise to that table, so we work with them very much. But there's also conservation organizations, Audubon and Crane Trust, federal agencies, Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Reclamation, water users, right? Natural resource districts are water users, public power districts, the Colorado water districts, Wyoming irrigation are all sitting at the table, all working together to manage the Platte River for the benefit of the ecosystem and the people who depend on it. So it's sort of broken up into a few things, and one of the things that, of course, we're actively involved in is the water plan. And the water plan is basically uses incentive-based water projects to provide water throughout the Central Platte River habitat, which hopefully will improve and maintain habitat for those target species: the whooping crane, the piping plover, the least tern, and as well downstream for the pallid sturgeon choosing that lower. So how do we do that? There's a number of things, but the big one for us, of course, is in Lake McConney. As part of our agreement, part of the water in Lake McConney is set aside for what's called an environmental cap. A certain percentage of the water that flows into McConney is set aside to be managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in support of the species and the health of the Central Platte watershed. Oftentimes it's used to mimic natural spring flows, so when the whooping cranes come in the spring, we have the right amount of flow coming to protect them. And throughout the summer, it's used to help suppress invasive vegetation, like salt cedar and phragmites and things like that. Having that water flow and prevent the spread of those is one way that we use that water. And other projects, other plans is, where the program is buying water from irrigators to, increase the amount of water that's in the river. Water recharge projects along the Central Platte are all part of that water plan. So there's also a land plan, which was set across to protect, restore, and maintain about 10,000 acres of habitat. And this involves things like restoring the natural health of that river along the Central Platte. And what I mean by that is, making sure vegetation is cleared. The river is wide like it used to historically be. Bare sandbars for least terns and piping plovers. Clear views, right? So whooping cranes can roost in the Platte River as they prefer to have those views, so they know they're not going to get eaten. So work to maintain and restore, more than 10,000 acres of habitat between basically between North Platte and Center City. So then we have our adaptive management portion, which basically is just saying that every single year we do all this work, we do all these studies. At the end of the year, we look back and say what worked and what didn't. And everyone is willing to adapt to figure out what is best for the Platte River watershed. And of course, you have your piping plovers and your pallid sturgeons, which are two of those, critical species. And we don't have any pallid sturgeons in Central Platte, but they are using the Lower Platte. We're finding out they're using it in the Platte. And so what goes on in the Central Platte, of course, is really important to what's going on downstream. So that's our Platte River recovery project. We also work across the state, of course, and we couldn't do any work across state without our habitat partners. Our habitat partner section is biologists who work for Nebraska Game and Parks, but they work across that public-private. They work with landowners. We couldn't do stream projects. We couldn't do restoration projects without working with private landowners. And our habitat partners are a crucial part of that piece. They're the ones that know all these landowners. Like I said, 98% of Nebraska is privately owned. We have to have those habitat partner biologists that are out there working with landowners to help us improve the integrity of those watersheds. We also have our ag program, and she works with the USDA and other ag partners basically to improve wildlife habitat and watershed ecology. Nebraska's an ag state. As much as we love to have it be all wild and natural, we rely on ag in this state to drive our economy. And our ag program is critical to work with those producers and those other ag agencies to make sure that, the ecological integrity of the watershed is sound. And then, of course, we have our wetlands program. And, the wetlands are the filter of the watershed, right? They're the water cleaner. So critical to a healthy watershed and to a healthy environment. I can't say enough about all the great work that our wetlands team does. They manage wetlands, they restore wetlands. Of course, they work with a ton of partnerships, like Rainwater Basin Joint Venture, and they work with all the NRDs, and they just do so much work with all these people to not only maintain the watersheds or the wetlands we have, but to increase them and to improve ones and restore ones. And they also do a ton of outreach. And if you guys have never seen these videos, just Google YouTube Wetlands of Nebraska. There's a whole series of videos that were done by our wetlands team, and they are just fantastic. I can't recommend them. I really kind of was tempted to turn this presentation just into showing you clips of these videos because they're really good, but they'll do it much more justice than me. So Wetlands of Nebraska on YouTube is a great series to watch. Then, of course, I'll jump into our parks here. When you think of Nebraska Game and Parks and our parks, of course you think of, beaches and camping, and of course, Lake McConaughey pictured here, and all of the people that venture out there to that beautiful sand. But we have parks all across the state, of course, right? Swimming beaches, boating, camping, all rely on a healthy watershed and healthy water quality. And in some cases, in some of our reservoirs, not healthy water, where we have water quality alerts posted on our beaches later in the summer. And we work very, very closely with Department of Environment and Energy and their beach monitoring program. And we also work with local health departments to ensure that our beaches and lakes are safe for anybody that's going to be out there using them. They're monitored weekly for E. coli bacteria and toxic algae. And those results are posted every single Thursday. As a matter of fact, the most recent post just came out right before this presentation started. So there's a picture of that. No beaches are under health alert. So that's good. With a little bit of warmer weather coming on, the beaches are all open and ready to go. So we work very closely with them to inform all of our users about any issues that may happen. So, and of course, I'll promote their website. That website's really hard to remember. So if you just Google NDEE Beach Watch, it'll get you right there. And it's updated weekly. Usually every Thursday night, there's an update. And if you're heading out to the lake, you can get a pretty good idea of what's going on there through that. And of course, kayaks have become a thing. They're everywhere. Everyone's got them, it seems. And we've really had to expand the way we look at water and recreation throughout the state. It's just so much more usage out there. Of course, only in Nebraska will you find folks floating down in a cattle water tank, but pretty fun way to use one of our trails. But we've had municipalities building these things as well, right? Kearney has this whitewater trail. Norfolk has a new whitewater trail. And of course, you can always go out the old-fashioned way and hop on the Elkhorn River, Platte River, the Loop, and with your kayak and travel down that way. So we've really put a lot of focus on those water trails, keep them safe, making sure that the watershed is good, the water is good, and doing our best. As we move into a drought cycle, it looks like I can't promise that there's going to be a lot of water to float, but there should be some, and it's a good way to enjoy it. And of course, this brings us back to that watershed, right? We've talked about all of the things that we do, and I know I've said watershed probably somewhere around 300 times, but it really is the impetus of what we do, how we do it. We can't just look at a lake. We can't just look at a stream. We have to look at the whole thing, and we have to assess the whole thing and do the best we can with what we have to protect those reservoirs, those lakes, those streams that our citizens are using and recreating in. So, as we move forward, we will continue to work with our partners and assess these, do our best we can to protect them and restore them as we move into the future. Because we don't want to see these sorts of things, right? These harmful algal blooms or these, brown murky lakes. And we'll continue to work with our partners to test that water and make sure that it's safe. And if you haven't ever been to Platte River State Park, I highly recommend it. It's one of the most beautiful water features we have in the state. And with that, I'd gladly take any questions that may exist. There's a picture of Brett hard at work marking fish, and our director Tim McCoy looking at some invasive carp species, looking to take him out on the boat, and then hopefully me in a few years retire just fixing nets. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for presenting for us, Mike. Excuse me, I'm gonna take a second and I'm just gonna introduce Conservation Nebraska and what we do. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. My name is Cherry Pham and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts such as this presentation and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Again, thank you for coming tonight. There will be a brief survey that should take about a minute or two to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. Also, I will be dropping Conservation Nebraska's email in the chat. Feel free to let us know if you have any community conservation concerns that you want us to talk about, any comments or any questions that you may have. That will just be the general info email, and they'll redirect you to someone. Again, like Mike said, if you have any questions, drop those in the Q&A section and we can get those answered for you. But thank you everyone so much for coming tonight. And if anyone was interested, the email is in the chat now. I'll give it a few more minutes just so people have time to fill out the survey, and in about a minute we can call it a day. Right.
I
I
never
think
know if there's no questions, does that mean either I did really good or really bad? I always like
I
one
think you did
question at
great.
least.
It was really interesting, but
Good.
I think we can stop recording now.